Okay, so now that we know how angiosperms or flowering plants reproduce, today we're going to go to the other side of the classification chart and talk about how one of the non-vascular plant reproduces. And we're going to look specifically at the moss. Okay, now remember that a non-vascular plant, like we said, does not have veins. That's what that V is supposed to remind you of. So the question then is, how do the moss reproduce? And that's what we're going to look at. If you're doing your handwritten notes, I realize this picture is a little bit blurry, but it should be about, pretty much have it by now. Name at the top. This is going to be notes number 12 in the corner. Title is Life Cycle of a Moss, and then your divider line. Okay, so just by way of review, again, the two main phyla for the plant kingdom are the vascular and the non-vascular plants. Okay, vascular meaning they have veins, and non-vascular meaning they do not have veins. The two types of vascular plants, they either reproduce by seeds or seedless. I will go ahead and tell you that the seedless vascular plants typically reproduce by spores, which we're going to look at today. So nothing too particular here. And then for the seed producing plants, vascular plants, we talked about how angiosperms reproduce. And that's again how the formation of the flower with pollination, fertilization, and then obviously the ovary growing into a fruit. That can produce either monocots or dicots. Nothing really changes for depending on whether it will be a monocot or a dicot plant. Gymnosperms, however, do not use flowers. Instead, they use cones, typically, or some kind of hard berry. And this process is actually a little bit different. So we're going to talk about that next week. But today we're going to jump over to the other side of the chart here in general. Let me be a different color here. So today we're going to go over to this side again, the non-vascular plants. We're going to look at how the bryophytes groups reproduce and specifically how mosses reproduce. So just keep in mind this chart here. This will help you kind of keep things straight, and you are going to have to know information from this for your test. So just as a way of reminder, the seedless plants are the ferns, whisk fern. Actually, that's seedless vascular plants. That shouldn't even be in there. Ignore that. All right, so moss reproduction. All plants in general may reproduce either sexually or asexually. And the only difference is if they reproduce sexually, that just means there are two separate gametes that come together. It's the male plus the female. Okay, that would be sexual reproduction. If they are reproducing asexually, there are no male and female gametes. It's just that particular plant kind of clones itself, or it copies its DNA and makes another one of itself. So moths reproduce sexually, which means they are going to have the male gamete and the female gamete. And there are two stages. Typically, when we think of moths, we think of moths in the gametophyte stage, which is what you see over here on the left. Now, in that word gametophyte, you can actually hear the word gamete, okay, which basically just means the sex cell, whether male or female. If it's the male sex cell, the male gamete is the sperm. If it's the female sex cell, the female gamete is called the egg. So typically we see moss in this kind of fluffy green carpet look. That is the gametophyte stage. All that means is in this stage, the gametophytes are forming. So each separate stalk of the moss, which looks like a little spike, almost like little spikes in here. Each of those is either a male or a female, and depending on which gamete it produces, would tell you whether it's a male stalk or a female stalk. The second stage of moth reproduction is the sporophyte stage, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later, but for right now I just want you to notice that the sporophyte stage is where you still have the green fluffy at the bottom, but these long stalks kind of stick up out of the fluffy green thallus, and at the top there's a capsule. That's what this little ball is right here. Inside of that are the spores, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But the sporophyte is where these stalks are produced. At the sporophyte stage, that means that the male and female gamete have already come together to be able to reproduce an organism. So we'll get to that in just a little bit. In the first stage, the male and female gametes are produced on separate parts of the plant. So like I said, you have one stalk producing the male gamete, the other stalk producing the female gamete. The male gamete would be producing sperm, and then the female gamete would be producing egg. So this is called the gametophyte stage. Again, that word gamete is actually in the name, and that should remind you that the gametophyte stage is where the gametes are being formed. The male sex cells and the female sex cells are being produced. Now, once these gametes are produced, the reason why moths only grow in moist areas is for this reason. In order for the male gamete to swim over to the female gamete, there has to be water present. Okay, in the last picture on the last slide, it won't let me go back when I'm recording. So in the last picture, you had the male stalk over here, the female stalk over here. And there's no way for the male gamete to get from here to the female gamete without something carrying it over there, right? So think about flowers, for example. The reason why it's so important that they have pollinators is the pollinators, whether it be wind or bugs or animals, birds, whatever it is, those objects help carry the pollen grains from the anther and get it to the stigma, okay? Without them, you just have pollen grains sitting there and then a stigma sitting there. There's no fertilization ever taking place. So for moss, however, there are no pollinators. There's no pollen or anything, but it does have to involve water. So if these two, so we have the, let me go back to my other color here. So let's say here's the male, here's the female stalk, okay? If where the moss is located, if it's covered, if it becomes covered in water, so nearby a lake or there's a lot of rain maybe in that environment at a particular time, then the male stalk knows, hey, there's water present. They will release the little sperm cells. The sperm cells are able to swim, okay? The egg cells are not, and the sperm cells will swim over to the egg cells. Okay, that's what you're seeing in this diagram below. Let me erase my black line here. Okay, so down here, let me do it in purple, I guess. Down here, over here, we have the male sex cell. Okay, here's the sperm. He is released into the water by the moss plant. Okay, that's what you see the little guy swimming here for. Okay, he's released into the water by the moss plant only when water is present, only when the moss is covered with water. It will not release those male sperm cells if there's no water there because they're not going to be able to swim. So the sperm cells swim, 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 and he comes over here to the female stalk, which is right here. Okay. Then it kind of travels down this tube down here to where the egg cells are. Okay, so the sperm cell unites with the egg cell, and you should hopefully know by now that that is what we call fertilization. So whether you have the handwritten notes or the printed notes, I want you to write fertilization right below this sentence in the notes. So handwritten notes, people, you're doing, mine's down here, the very bottom, okay? We're talking about the life cycle. The plants may reproduce sexually or asexually. Cannot really see that writing. Moths reproduce sexually in 2 phases. I wrote number 1 gametophyte in a different color just so it sticks out. Male and female gametes are produced on separate parts of the plant. Again, there's one stalk producing male gametes, another stalk producing female gametes. When water, which is super, super important, when water hits the moss, the male gametes are released and they swim over to the female gametes. When those two things meet, that right there is the fertilization. Extremely important. So I wrote it in red, there's stars, exclamation points all around it. So if you're doing the handwritten notes, I do want you to write that in as well. But that is where the fertilization takes place. Male and female gamete have met up. That is what will form into a new plant. Once fertilization takes place, we then go into the sporophyte stage. The male and female gamete grow into a structure called a sporophyte. Now, a sporophyte has 2 parts. It has this long, kind of skinny looking stalk, and then on top, it's like almost like a little container that's called the capsule, okay? And the capsule is full of tiny little, almost not like, they're not seeds, but they're like seeds. They're called spores, okay? Spores are more like whereas a seed is more solid, it's kind of bigger, it's hard around the outside usually. A spore is just one single cell, so it's very, very small, and it's kind of more like dust. And those spores, every single one of them, wherever they drop onto the ground, usually carried by wind, wherever they drop onto the ground, if the conditions are right for growing, then it will produce a new plant, a new moss plant. Okay, so the male and female gamete have met up. The spore or the sporophyte stage starts. The stalk kind of bursts out of the green fluffy thallus down here. The spore shoots up, and at the very top of that, the capsule forms. So when the capsule is mature, okay, it will burst like what you see in this picture on the left. Okay, the sporophyte stage is when the spores are released. The spores then settle somewhere else, and if the conditions are right, a new plant will grow. Okay, so the capsule on top of the little stalk for the sporophyte stage, this little thing right here, there's two parts to it. Down here you have kind of like the base, and up here it almost looks like a Hershey kiss, like a little top on top. What happens is when the sporophyte state, when it's fully mature, when the capsule is matured and it knows it's the right time to release, it will burst, and this top part, the cap, will actually pop off. And the spores, what you're seeing in this left picture, that's what comes flying out. Okay, and you can see, like I said, they're like little, it's almost like little pieces of dust. Okay, super duper small, which is good for the moss because then those small little spores can be carried by wind, carried by animals, carried by water, whatever it is. And wherever those spores settle, just like seeds, if the condition is right, the new moss plant will grow. Okay, here's another picture of it. And then I kind of put this in the handwritten notes you'll see in a minute, but this is actually one of our vocab words, I believe. believes, believe. A spore is a one-celled reproductive unit. Okay, there are lots of plants that reproduce by spores. On the review a little bit ago, I told you that ferns and whisk ferns, horsetails, club mosses, those kinds of things, those are all technically vascular plants, yet they still reproduce by spores. That's what you're seeing in this picture on the left here. Okay, each of these little, you can't really see that color, can you? Each of these little clusters underneath the leaf is a cluster of spores. Okay, so this looks to be like a fern plant, and that is how they reproduce instead of seed. They have little spore clusters underneath. In the right picture though over here on the right of the screen, this is more of a zoomed in, I guess, kind of microscopic microphotography type thing of a spore capsule. This would be the top. This would be the capsule right here. This would be the top, sorry. And then this, I believe, is a spore capsule that has already burst and released the spores from the inside. Then the new plant that grows goes back to the gametophyte stage. So in this picture, you're kind of seeing a big clump of moss. Actually, last year I had a student, he found moss in the sporophyte stage outside somewhere, and he actually like picked it and brought it into me, and I was shocked at how small these were. Okay, this is an itty bitty clump of moss, and then these little stalks are even more itty bitty. So, but anywhere that you see this kind of green fluffy part on the ground, that part of the moss plant is in the gametophyte stage. Anywhere that you see these stalks, that is the sporophyte stage. So it is possible to have a moss, like a clump of moss kind of all together, where you have different stages present at one time. But the either way, if there's just the green kind of fluffy thallus, that's the gametophyte, meaning the gametes are being formed. And then anywhere you see the stalk, we consider that to be the sporophyte stage. So, handwritten notes, people. Again, you can see my fertilization kind of highlight there. And then I put stage 2 as the sporophyte stage. The spores are released and settle somewhere else. And if conditions are right, a new plant will grow. Down here is where I put the definition for spore, a one-celled reproductive unit. And then the new plant goes back to the gametophyte stage and basically starts back at the beginning. So the best way to do this then is to kind of write the moss life cycle in stages. There'll be 6 stages. And then again, handwritten notes, people, I went onto the back and I'll show you how to write that at the end here. But 6 stages. First stage, Okay, in the diagram here on the left, you can see it's written in a cycle, like a life cycle, continuous life cycle. Up here is going to be stage 1, okay, where the spores are. You can barely see. There we go, stage 1. So a spore, which is kind of like the moss version of a seed, but it's much, 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 much smaller. A spore lands on a moist, nutrient-rich spot and grows. Remember, this is a non-vascular plant, meaning it's very, very short. It does not grow tall because it doesn't have those tubes to transport water and nutrients. So it has to land on a moist spot where there's plenty of nutrients for the moss to grow. Second stage. So we had first stage here. This is going to be second, and this is also part of the second stage here. It grows into into a moss plant that is green and often forms a soft bud. Okay, this is where you're going to see the moss that looks kind of like just that big patch of green grass on the ground. Okay, usually it's very soft. Sometimes if it's getting ready to get into the sporophyte stage, it might form little soft buds that might eventually grow up into stalks. But either way, the point of it's still in the gametophyte stage. The point of it is it's producing the male and female gametes on different parts of the moss plant. Stage 3, that's going to be kind of in between. So we have stage 1, this is like 2, and then 2 continued. 3 is going to be somewhere in between number 2 and then this part right here. But in phase number 3, buds that are near the tip of the moss plant begin making the gametes. Okay, and the way you tell whether that particular stalk of the moss plant is male or female, if the gametes that are formed are eggs, the moss plant is a female. If the buds that make gametes that can swim, which are called sperm, the plant is considered a male. Okay, the sperm cells would look something like this on a microscopic level, and the egg cells would look something like this. Remember, these are just one cell, which if you remember from our microscopy lab when we looked at cells with the microscopes, these are very, 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 very small. Stage 4, when a male and female plant live together and water is present, so that means basically these stalks have been covered up by water, okay, giving the sperm something to swim in. A male gamete, which is the sperm, swims to a female gamete and fertilizes it. That's going to be pretty much this stage right here, okay? Then stage 5 is going to be over here. The fertilized egg divides. It would be kind of right about here where I put that little blue dot on the picture. Okay, the fertilized egg begins to reproduce new cells. It divides and grows into a stalk on top of the female moss plant. Okay, so that's what you're seeing in this picture here. Here's the stalk. The cells continue to divide to form a capsule at the tip of the stalk. That would be right here in the picture. And then inside the capsule, the spores form. And finally, this is going to be stage 6 up here. When it is mature, the capsule bursts open and releases the spores, okay? Which then we're back to stage 1, okay? So it's easiest to see it kind of in a cycle that continues to grow, because then those spores would begin growing into the gametophyte stage, and then, the process would go on and on. Now, one other thing I wanted to note is when we do our diagram in our notes here in just a second, you are going to have to distinguish between gametophyte and sporophyte stages. So I'm going to show you in this picture here real quick, and then in a minute I'll show you what your diagram should look like when you're finished. But over here, all of this, I'm not going to be able to write out the whole word, but all of this is the gametophyte stage. Okay, where the moss plant is solely focused on forming gametes. Once the male and female gametes have met up, okay, so that's the fertilization right here in the middle where they put this big red star, okay, then the moss plant is now, you do it in purple, is now in the sporophyte stage. That spore cannot form until the male and female gamete have come together, okay? So that's another thing you're going to want to distinguish in your diagram as well. Oh, number 7. If the spore falls on moist ground, the process starts over again. So this is just another way to look at it. It's a little more in depth, but this would be stage 1, where the spores fall into moist ground. This is stage 2. It begins to grow. Stage 3, the stalks are forming gametophytes. Then in stage 4, when those stalks are covered in water, which you can see kind of right here, okay, the sperm cell is released. It swims over to the egg cell. Fertilization takes place. That's going to be kind of continuing on here with stage 4. Stage 5 is where the fertilized egg begins to grow into a stalk. Stage 6, the stalk develops a capsule at the top where all the spores are. They would be inside of here, inside that little capsule. And then when the capsule is mature, it will burst open. That would be stage 7, or no, that's stage 6. And then 7 is if the spores fall on moist ground, they begin to grow again. And now we're back to stage 1. So I believe I am going to put this into the Jupyter pod after this notes video, but I do only want you to watch these little sections of the video. The rest of it's really not important and kind of goes into a little more detail than what we need to know. So watch these sections, though. It gives a really good overview of the moss reproduction cycle.